when one of my granddaughters asked me, how's the weaving going, I thought I'd show them. So, this is my loom. It was my dad's. He had it in the late 1940s. Lived in a house with passageways that needed rugs, so he set to and wove some rugs. It was up in that house until they moved to Leicester, and when they moved to Leicester I was tiny and he wove a pram cover for me, and it was up in the first house we lived in Leicester, and I grew up with it being up in the attic. That's my dad just after he retired, and this is one of those rugs that he made. And beside it, 3 of my shuttles. The middle one and the bottom one my dad used, but the top one we got from Bradford. It's too big for my loom, but here's a shawl that my father made for my mother, a scarf he made for me as a toddler, and a piece of cloth, quite fine cloth, that he wove as a heather mixture, which my mother tailored into a little waistcoat, a bolero. Then, when we moved to another house, it had to go into the shed. And then when my parents retired and moved, and sadly my father died, Felicity and I took the opportunity to move it up to Yorkshire, where we were living, just outside Bradford, in the heart of the weaving part of the country. And I set it up and had a wonderful time experimenting, making some odds and ends. When we moved to Shropshire, I put it up again and enjoyed weaving some more. And then when we moved to Cheltenham, it had to go away again. So, in lockdown, it came out. I've set it up in the shed, and I'm going to show you how the loom works. I've got some books that I've used, and the first one that I used was an instruction manual that came with the loom itself. Then I got myself a Teach Yourself book, Teach Yourself Hand Weaving. That's been very helpful, and along with that, another book, an American book, The Joy of Hand Weaving. So, those were the basic books that I used to begin with. But after lockdown, and I put the loom up again, Felicity gave me a present for my birthday, and it's been wonderful. And this is a more modern book, Next Steps in Weaving. This is my loom. It's a table loom. It's 3 feet wide, the old measurements because it's so old, and it has 4 shafts. 1, 2, 3, 4. Each shaft can be raised with a handle. That's shaft number 1, raised, and it drops. Shaft number 2, raised. Shaft number 3, raised, and it can be dropped. And shaft number 4. They can be raised in whatever combinations you want, and that's what makes the patterns. Attached to each shaft are these wires here. In the middle of the wire is a tiny little hole, and those are called the heddles. And when you set up the loom, the warp ends that go from back to front have to be threaded carefully through each of those. And not only through those, but this is called the reed, and it's used to beat the cloth as you weave. And this one has lots and lots of metal pieces in it, and between them are gaps, and the gaps are called the dents, and there are 14 dents in 1 inch. And you use a reed hook in order to help you put the hook through there, through the heddle, catch the yarn, and bring it back through. When you've set up all the warp, then you use a shuttle. I've got a lovely shuttle. This is my favourite. We bought it when we were in Bradford, and it's a really good old shuttle with sharp points to make sure it doesn't snag the ends, and a bobbin that goes on a rod in the middle, and you wind the bobbin up, thread it through, and then the shuttle carries the weft across the loom. So the warp goes end to end, back to front, front to back. The weft goes across, and the way to remember is that the shuttle goes across quickly. It's swift, it's fast, it's swift. The weft is swift and goes goes across. The shuttle is swift and creates the weft across the width of the loom. On the wall, I've got a warping frame. It's what I use to make sure that the warp ends are all the right length. I'll show you how it works in a minute. There are pegs up one side, across the top, down the other side, across the bottom, and you use it to make sure that the warp ends are all the correct length. You'll see in a moment. My loom is a Weavemaster Loom. My warping frame is a Harris Loom. Ha! You'll see me wearing a Harris tweed jacket in a minute, one of my favourites. Excellent to weave with when it's cold in the winter. I put my loom on an old trolley that came from Gran's, so it's lovely to remember her as well when I'm doing my weaving. One of the books said it was a good idea to have a table that was slightly lower than an ordinary dining table, and then an adjustable stool to make sure you could sit as comfortably as possible. Well, Gran had a lovely stool as well. So I've got a lovely stool with a cover that Felicity has crocheted for me specially.
Here are some of the things I made when we were in Yorkshire and in Shropshire. One of the first things I did in lockdown was a colour sampler. You can see it at the top left. It's a square. The three primary colours, red, yellow and blue, and the three secondary colours, orange, green and violet, are in sequence across the warp and in sequence up the weft. And that means that I've got 36 squares showing how those different colours mix and match. It was an idea in Osmer Gallinger Todd's book, The Joy of Hand Weaving. It seemed doubly appropriate at the beginning of lockdown with us having rainbows in our windows. I went on then to learn all sorts of new techniques with Pattie Graver's books, The Next Steps in Weaving. On the right, you've got a set of things that I've done with her guidance, discovering how to do a selvage, that's getting the edges of the cloth right, with a floating selvage, and how to do a draft, a pattern, in preparation for your weaving. I'm going to show you how I wove Pattie Graver's Hydrangea Bouquet Scarf using yarn from the Craft Kutch in Bridgend Market. The draft or pattern in Next Steps in Weaving was written for a Table Loom, so I first had to rewrite it for my Table Loom. The top part of the pattern shows me how to thread the warp. The first row, the bottom row, represents shaft 1, the second row up, shaft 2, shaft 3 and shaft 4. You always read the pattern from right to left, and notice that there's a 0 in the first column. That's because the very first yarn, you put the reed hook through the first dent on the reed, but it does not go through a heddle on any of the shafts. That's because it's the very edge of the material, and it's called the selvage. Whenever I weave, I make sure that the shuttle goes over that yarn end, warp end, and then it comes out at the other side under the floating selvage at the other side. Then it goes over that selvage to come back, and it comes out under the one on the right hand side, and then it goes in, over, comes out under, over and under, and in that way you get a neat edge to your material. Then the first part of the pattern proper, you can see 3, and that means that I put the reed hook through the next dent on the reed, and then through the heddle on shaft 3, and then I loop the yarn over the hook and pull it back through, and then the next dent goes through the heddle on shaft 3 again. The next dent changes colour. It's a flame colour on shaft 1, and then the next dent shaft 1, and the next dent shaft 3 and shaft 3, and then I change colour again to cornflower on shaft 1, and then shaft 2, then shaft 3, then shaft 4, then shaft 1, then shaft 4, then shaft 3, then shaft 2, then shaft 1, and you can see how the pattern in this particular draft is created with the arrangement of the warp ends. And I'm going to warp it at 14 ends per inch. So all the way over to number 14, you can see, is the first inch of my piece of material. So if you're ready, I'm going to show you how I prepare the warp. Each warp end has to be 3.5 yards long, just over 3 meters. So to make sure they're all the correct length, I use my warping frame. And then I hang all the ends up on a set of hooks, color-coded. I sit at the front of the loom and thread the warp from right to left. I push the reed hook through the dent on the reed and then through the heddle on the appropriate shaft and then pull the thread through. That's called slaying the warp. Following the original instruction manual, I do that in bundles of 12 ends. I then tie them onto the back roller and then roll them onto the back roller very carefully, keeping the tension right, and tie them onto the front roller as well. Then I'm ready to start the weft. So I get my shuttle out and I've got to wind my bobbin up. For this pattern, the weft is entirely in a royal blue. I then have to thread the end through the end of the shuttle, and now I'm ready to start the weaving the weft. The draft for the weft goes down the right-hand side of the page. It shows me the 4 shafts once again, and it shows me the first time the shuttle passes through the warp, I lift shafts 3 and 4. When it comes back, I lift shafts 1 and 4, then shafts 1 and 2, 2 and 3, 3 and 4, 2 and 3, 1 and 2, 1 and 4. And that basically creates the pattern for the weft. And in this pattern, it repeats all the way through. To double check that I've got it threaded correctly, I colour in the squares of the graph paper to the left and of the weft and underneath the warp. So, with a little bit of help from my friend Lowry Phillips, I'm ready to start weaving. Once I've completed the weft, I have to make sure that none of those warp ends unravel. So I do a hem stitch carefully from right to left. Now I'm ready to cut off the warp, and this is the first time that I'm going to see whether my pattern has worked. Having done the cut, I carefully unroll the whole of my cloth, and there we have it, a lovely scarf. And a little bit of a sampler for me to keep as well. There's one more thing for me to do. I need to tidy up the fringe. So I'm going to twist the fringe. And I take 2 groups of 3 threads and I twist them together to create a lovely fringe. And my scarf is complete.